Warning: the following video contains mild spoilers for the Pathfinder modules and adventure paths listed below. I will limit spoilers as much as I can, but I will have to talk about them obliquely. You have been warned. Hello YouTube and welcome to Prime Productions. I'm here to help enhance your tabletop gaming experience. If you're new to this channel, I primarily cover Paizo tabletop role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. So Paizo has recently come out with yet another book, Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms. This book is chock full of a bunch of stuff, not only information about what the Shining Kingdoms are up to, but also new archetypes, new feats for existing archetypes, new ancestry feats, new wizard schools, a ton of new magic items, kind of everything. So let's get into it. What are the Shining Kingdoms? Well, despite the name, they are 6 countries, not necessarily kingdoms, that kind of represent the core European fantasy cliche in the Pathfinder world of Golarion. Knights and dragons, elves and dwarves, all of that stuff. And some of them have strong thematic ties to real-world historical countries, though of course they aren't exactly the same. So I'm going to get into the book, but before I do, I just want to list off the 6 Shining Kingdoms and kind of give you a brief rundown. Andrin is kind of like the colonial United States if the US actually believed that all men were created equal. Duma is late-stage capitalism personified, basically a plutocracy where you can literally buy government positions. Then there are the Five Kings Mountains, which is the dwarf civilization, Gault, which is essentially revolutionary France if the series of revolutions went on for over 50 years. That may have ended recently, by the way. Konin is the insular elven nation that recently got rid of a demon infestation that had been plaguing them for a while. And finally there is Taldor, which is basically the ancient Roman Empire in decline, but it looks like they are maybe turning things around. Now before I get into the book, I need to give you some context on the Shining Kingdoms and a history lesson. Don't worry, I'll try to keep it brief. Firstly, I need to mention the Gravelands. See, relatively recently, a super lich named Tar Bafon broke out of his prison and took over this section of land, and he's really messing up the place with his army of undead. And he's also looking to expand into the Shining Kingdoms, especially into Duma. Secondly, I need to discuss the history of Taldor. Taldor used to be a massive empire. That's why I liken it to the ancient Roman Empire. However, a series of disastrous wars, combined with the fact that the Taldan nobility kept giving themselves more and more money instead of, investing in infrastructure, caused a bunch of problems. Because a large chunk of the country's needs weren't being met, many sections of Taldor rebelled. One, called Cheliax, rebelled and basically took a huge swath of what used to be Taldor. Long story short, Cheliax used to be a theocracy to the god Erodin. When Erodin died, their country collapsed, and when all was said and done, a cunning but ethically bankrupt woman who summons devils was ruler of the remains. Now the country is full of diabolic, devil-worshipping, legalistic oligarchs with no morals. They also really got into slavery, particularly of halflings. Unsurprisingly, this didn't sit too well with some people, so what would become Andrin and eventually Gault broke off into their own countries. Andrin was the first country in this section of the world to outright ban slavery, while Gault got locked into a succession of revolutions. Now, Cheliax technically isn't part of the Shining Kingdoms, but like I said, Taldor, Gault, and Andrin are, so that's why I had to talk about them. Okay, now on to the actual book. It is divided into 8 sections. Firstly, there's kind of a primer about the history of the Shining Kingdoms, including a quite extensive timeline. Then there is a chapter devoted to each of the countries. Each of these chapters includes information about the country's history, plot hooks for adventures, info on the country's big cities. Most of these chapters have info about the country's capital, but the dwarf section has a different city because the dwarven capital of Highhelm already got a book. Each section also has general information at a glance and new player options such as archetypes, new magic items, and other things. Finally, the last chapter has some new monsters. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so for these countries, I'll give a brief overview, one of the current events going on in that country, a plot hook that I spotted, and then we'll talk about the city that the book talks about for that country, and then I'll tell you what player options there are. Let's get started. Andrin is up first, and like I said, they are kind of like colonial America. They broke away from Cheliax when the Devil Summoners took over and were the first democracy in the area. Unfortunately, being the first democracy, they didn't quite have all the kinks worked out, and the country has major corruption problems with their politicians. Actually, their version of the president, Supreme-elect Endura Mashsuek, I hope I pronounced that correct, has done a good job rooting out the corruption and is getting the country back on track. Sadly, she's reaching her term limit. Yeah, politicians in Andrin have term limits. I mentioned this in a previous video, but the big plot hook with Andrin is the Hellfire Crisis. If you missed my previous video, tensions are rising between Andrin and Cheliax, and that will explode into an all-out war in the Hellfire Crisis, an upcoming Paizo-wide crossover event. The chapter also talks about Almas, the capital city of Andrin, and has one new archetype, the Eagle Knight. Eagle Knights are an elite paramilitary group with different branches for different specializations. They're all about being mobile, moderately armored, and skilled in both combat and social situations. The chapter also has new magic items, including a new gun that the Eagle Knights use, new skill feats, a few new Eagle Knight themed spells, though theoretically anyone could learn them, lots of stuff. Next up is Duma. This small country is run by, well, essentially robber barons. See, the country is more or less run by the prophets of Calistrade, otherwise known as Callistrocrats. These jerks follow a sort of philosophy religion that's pretty weird. They are kind of like Calvinists if anyone ever took a sociology class. They are people who think that they should make as much money as possible but not spend too much of it on themselves, so they all reinvest into their own businesses. But Callistocrats also have weird rules like not being able to touch non-Callistocrats, so they all wear these white robes and these white gloves at all times. Oh, and I think they're trying to buy their own afterlife through some sort of weird magic ritual? But this ritual requires them to live very specific lives, like they can never donate to charity. That might actually be changing though. Some Callistocrats are urging for a change in their philosophy in order to accommodate a change in the world. Like, gasp, actually paying taxes so the country can have a standing army. Wealthy people willing to pay taxes? Wow, this is a fantasy game. The reason they need a standing army is that Tar-Baphon is trying to invade their lands. That is, surprise surprise, disrupting trade routes, especially since undead who don't need to breathe are ambushing their shipments on the waterways. The book has information on the capital of Curse, which is super opulent. I guess spending money on buildings doesn't count against the rules of Callistocrats somehow. There's also an archetype in this section, Prophet of Calistrade. This is an occult, charisma-based spellcasting archetype, kind of like a bard. They also have their own wizard spell school based on the Prophets of Calistrade as well. They also have a second archetype called Black Jacket. Black Jackets are basically an order of bodyguard mercenaries that almost always contract to protect Callistocrats. This archetype has a lot to do with battlefield strategy and helping your allies fight better. This chapter also has a new llama-like animal companion as well as a lizard animal companion. Next up is the Five Kings Mountains area, which is the dwarven nation in this part of Galarian. I say nation, it's actually just a series of 6 city-states, each ruled by a king or king-like authority figure. Each city-state kind of follows the lead of the King of Highhelm, the de facto leader, but getting them to agree to unify into one nation has been notoriously difficult. Oh, and of course there are other smaller settlements all throughout the land. There are a few current events that have happened in the Five Kings Mountains. One is that they found a huge deposit of adamantine and used that to craft Torag's Shield, a retractable metal wall made of adamantine that can secure Highhelm. In less good news, an evil conspirator dragon wants to take over the entirety of the Five Kings Mountains and has hired spies to do her dirty work as well as using her own draconic abilities towards that same end. This section also has information on Larod, a holy dwarven city, which is said to be the site of where Fulgrit, a dwarven god of children, protected kids who got lost. Now it's a big holy city where many dwarves go to on pilgrimage, and it kind of has a bunch of churches and orphanages. This section doesn't have any new archetypes, but does have new options for the Stalwart Defender, a dwarf-themed bodyguard-style archetype from the Highhelm book I mentioned earlier. Also, there are a few new spells based on the Rivathun, which is dwarven animism. I want to point out the spell Spiritual Transport, a spell that is like Translocate but lets you take your familiar with you. And then there are some new familiar and animal companion options. I'm a fan of the Grindeldrake here. Lastly, there are a few new magic items, including some new runes that I think are restricted only to the Dwarven Clan Dagger. It doesn't say that in the mechanics of the rune, but it is heavily implied in the flavor text. Next up is Galt. Like I said, they are part of Cheliax, but eventually rebelled against them to form their own government. Here's the thing, when they first rebelled, several guillotine blades were crafted that could trap the souls of those beheaded inside of them. These so-called final blades were then used by the rebellion to decapitate Chelaxian officials. Man, talk about spiteful. Not only did these revolutionaries cut off their leaders' heads, they also trapped them for eternal torment and prevented them from going to the afterlife. But it turns out that wasn't the end. About 3 years later, the people decided these new rulers, the original revolutionaries, were as bad as the old Cheliaxian rulers and executed them via final blades again. This happened again, and again, and again, for over 50 years. Recently, it looks like this cycle has finally been put to an end, but only time will tell. There's more to this story, but I don't want to spoil one particular Pathfinder module. Today, the major problem that Galt faces is backsliding into their old ways. There is yet another revolution that is looking to overthrow the latest revolution, though this one is different. It's led by this person here, the Catacomb Queen, and let's just say that they don't have the country's best interests at heart. Again, super spoilerific, so I won't go into details, but this possible revolution is looking a lot different than the previous ones. For one thing, all previous revolutions were enabled by a mysterious cult called the Grey Gardeners, but that particular group is gone now. This chapter also has a section on Isarn, the capital of Galt. Unsurprisingly, Isarn isn't doing great after nearly 60 years of constant revolution, but people are making an effort to repair it. Then the section has some new feats for the existing Ghost archetype. Also, there's a new magic item called the Splinter of Finality. It's a shard of one of those final blades. There's also an archetype that can be unlocked if you have that item. It's all about making the most use of the magic power of a splinter of one of those final blades. So the next section is about Konin, which is the Elven Nation. As one might expect of an Elven Nation, they are heavily forested and there's a bunch of cities made up of massive interconnecting tree houses. And unlike the dwarves of the Five Kings Mountains, Konin is actually a proper kingdom with a queen and everything. Now, Konin used to be isolationist, only allowing outsiders into one trade city, but things have changed. With Tar-Baphon breaking out, the elves of Konin have realized that he is an existential threat to the whole continent, so they have begun opening borders cautiously in order to open up diplomatic ties and get some more defenses going against that superlich. One last thing about the elves, they are space aliens. Yeah, they came from the next planet over called Castrovel thousands of years ago. They came through these things called Ayudara, which are these stone gateway portals. That'll be important for later. The big issue that Konin has faced for a long time was Tree Razor, a demon that has been plaguing that part of the forest. In a recent adventure path, he was defeated, but his body exploded, showering the land with his essence, so that might cause some problems down the line. Also, his demonic lieutenants are still out there, so there's still work to be done. On the bright side, though, there's a wedding coming up! The queen is officially getting married, so a lot of people in Konin are stoked for a royal wedding and the continuation of the royal bloodline. The chapter includes a section on Iadra, the capital of Konin, where the queen lives. There's also an archetype for those who hunt Tree Razor and his ilk called Wielderheart. I think that's how that's pronounced. They are an archetype that gets bonuses against demons and have ranger-like focus spells. There's also a new teleportation-based wizard school based on the Ayudara I mentioned earlier, and hey, with the border open, non-elves may have access to that school too. There's also a couple new magic items, including these fabulous new boots. Moving on to Taldor. First of all, remember what I said at the start of the video that Taldor used to be a much larger empire, but the nobility basically drove it into the ground with some very poor decisions? Now, a few years ago in Pathfinder 1, there was a civil war, and when all was said and done, the first female leader, Eutropia I, was put in charge. Eutropia is working desperately to change things around Taldor and has initiated many public policies to do things like fix infrastructure. But some of the nobility secretly hate this and are waiting for a politically expedient time to try and throw her out. There have even been assassination attempts on Eutropia, even though she's basically fixing the country and her policies are, broadly speaking, pretty popular. These nobles are trying to change that too, using propagandists to smear Eutropia's name. There's a lot more to it, but suffice it to say, it's a big mess. Actually, all the stress of the nobility literally trying to kill her so that they can fiddle as Rome burns has made Eutropia ill, and she is forced to hold court at a retreat outside of the capital of Opara. Speaking of which, there's a section on Opara, the capital city of Taldor. It was once a great city, but rich jerks throwing galas instead of investing in infrastructure means it's gone downhill. There are two new Taldor archetypes, the Lion Blades, which are kinda like the Bard Warrior Spies of the Taldan military. They had a pre-remaster version, but this is their remaster debut. There's also the new Ulfin Guard archetype. Ulfin Guards are descended from Norsemen who swore fealty to protect the crown of Taldor, kind of like the Normans of France if you know your history. They basically act as the secret service to the crown of Taldor, and the archetype is kinda half bodyguard, half barbarian. This section has some new magic items like a fan that can fold out into a buckler, as well as a cool short sword that lets lion blades find and recognize each other and helps them get in touch with lion blade resources. There's also some new apex items, which are high-level items that increase a particular ability score, and these ones also do something else. Lastly, the book has a pretty extensive bestiary in the back. I'm just going to hit some of my favorites. Seems those Taldor nobles who were trying to screw over the country may get what's coming to them in the end with this new monster. A sort of undead animated by avarice and money grubbing, so hey, they might end up being their own worst enemy. There's also a fiend that personifies death by bureaucracy, and an example of what happens when a prophet of Calistrate doesn't follow through with their obligations. And I love this artwork for these new ice fairies. Seems like they would be nasty to run into, though. Okay, so final thoughts on this book? Well, it's going to be a mixed bag for a lot of people. If you aren't into the lore of Pathfinder, if you aren't a GM that needs cool items to throw out or cool new monsters, then this may not be the book for you. On the other hand, if you're reading about all these crazy things going on in a campaign world and seeing all the inner workings of major political factions, then yeah, this is an absolute must-buy. I will say that some of the archetypes feel a little repetitive. Ulfen Guard, Black Jackets, Stalwart Defender, and to an extent Eagle Knights are all just kind of bodyguard, help allies kind of martial types. I would have loved to see some archetypes that were geared towards spellcasters or something. On the other hand, I love the 2 new wizard schools, and a lot of these items seem pretty cool. So yeah, if you want to buy it or not is entirely your decision. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Just remember to try and keep things civil. There's a difference between I don't think this book is for me and insulting everyone at Paizo. And as a reminder, I do my own third-party content. I just released the Civilian NPC Omnibus, a downloadable PDF at drivethrurpg.com. This book has 44 new NPC stat blocks from NPC levels -1 to 10. This time, most of them are themed around civilians you might encounter, from serfs to guildmasters. Check it out, link in the description below. A few people have been asking how they can help me out financially, and right now, this is the best way. But that's it for my thoughts on Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms. Make sure to like and subscribe. That lets not only me, but also YouTube know that you like this kind of content and would like to see more. And until next time, thank you, good luck, and happy gaming!